Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Getty Villa. Delighted to have an audience, a healthy audience in the room and an even healthier audience on Zoom attending tonight. So let me then welcome and provide a little bit of background on our speaker tonight, Israel Finkelstein. He is, I would say, without exaggeration, the leading voice and foremost archaeologist of ancient Israel of his generation. And his work has in many ways been transformative for the development of archaeology as a thoroughly scientific and more dialectical process of questioning and understanding and probing the remains of the ancient past that are revealed by archaeology. He has a daunting CV. I'll skim along it fairly briefly, but I do want to give a sense of the breadth of his interest and the impact it's had. He is currently the Professor Emeritus of Archaeology at Tel Aviv University, and he is the Director of the new School of Archaeology at the University of Haifa. He's a member of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities and a foreign member of the French Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres, and he's a member also of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in this country. Having done his PhD in 1983, he taught at the University of Chicago and at the Sorbonne in Paris, and spent research years also teaching in Harvard and at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He's done extensive excavations, principally, on many sites, but the one he's going to focus on today is Megiddo, as you see in the screen behind me. He's written over 20 books and hundreds of articles. I'll mention just some of the titles. The Archaeology of the Israelite Settlement, which grew out of his PhD work on the creation of the Israelite community and state, if you like. Living on the Fringe, on related subject of the pastoralism in the highland regions, The Bible Unearthed, and David and Solomon, two books in which he collaborated with Neil Asher Silverman. The Forgotten Kingdom, a reference to the northern kingdom of Israel, north of Judah, which is sometimes left out of the picture, and he very much brings it back into view. He's received innumerable prizes for his work, from the Institut de France, l'Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres. He's done extraordinary work, more recently on Hasmonean realities behind Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, and a new book on essays in biblical historiography from Jeroboam II to John Hyrcanus has come out just this year. In 2005, he was awarded the Dan David Prize in the Past Dimension. In 2009, he was awarded a Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters by the French Ministry of Culture, and it goes on and on. I think I'll leave it there, but only want to mention, because we're in this country, that he's been awarded in 2017 the McAllister Field Archaeology Award of the American Schools of Oriental Research. So he's had an extraordinary career, and is still having an extraordinary career. And I would say that his work is not just influential, but so much of the discussion and the major issues that are the subject of academic research in Israel, the archaeology of ancient Israel, are ideas that have either been put forward by him, challenging some of the orthodox views of the past, or their responses to the theories, the work that he's done, the excavation and the interpretation that he's provided for it. Whether it's relating to the issues of how to integrate the archaeological evidence with the textual record, obviously the Old Testament, or not to integrate them, as the case may be. Also issues of chronology. He's been very much at the forefront of a lower chronology for the early Iron Age, which has become as a matter of very active debate. And he's also brought a scientific perspective to the work in ways, I think for a few generations now, archaeologists have developed more and more a scientific approach to the excavation process itself. but he's developed it even to a further degree, particularly of microarchaeology, looking at the most minute traces of biological material, bringing DNA analysis to the bones and other material, archaeometallurgy and other things which are providing new insights into the ancient material. So no one has had a greater influence on the understanding of the Bronze and Iron Ages in ancient Israel than has Israel Finkelstein. And I'm delighted that he's with us tonight to provide for us, an overview of the archaeology and biblical history of ancient Megiddo. Here, Professor Israel.
Thank you very much, Tim, for the warm words. This is the moment to retire, maybe, after, this. What can I say? And I'm very happy to be here with you today to speak about Megiddo. I must say, and you could have heard from Tim, that I try to wear three hats in my research. One is traditional archaeology, the other one is biblical historiography, and the third one is the archaeological sciences. Today, I will focus mainly on the first two, which means try to shed light on several issues related to biblical history through the excavations at Megiddo in northern Israel, but here and there also archaeological sciences will crop into the lecture. So Megiddo, there you see here a beautiful picture of the site looking to the east in the direction of the Jezreel Valley. It's one of the most important sites in the Levant, in fact, a key site for the Bronze and Iron Age in the Levant, and I will explain why in a minute. Its importance stems first and foremost from its location on the main highway, which leads from the coastal plain, from Egypt and the coastal plain, to the Jezreel Valley, and then on to Mesopotamia, Syria, Mesopotamia, and in fact also to the north, to Anatolia. And in this picture you can see this main pass through the hills between the coastal plain of Israel and the Jezreel Valley, which is the breadbasket of ancient Israel. And Megiddo is marked on the left-hand side by the red circle. In the background you can see the mountains of the lower Galilee with Mount Tabor in the center, and Nazareth in fact is a little bit on the left. So the site is located in a very strategic place, also sitting on major water sources and on the beautiful valley, as I mentioned, the breadbasket of ancient Israel. Already in the Bronze Age, it was a major producer of a grain for the population of the region. Megiddo appears in all great textual sources of the ancient Near East, in fact. Egyptian for sure, Assyrian as well, one Hittite apparently source, and of course many times in the Bible. So this reflects its importance even beyond the borders of ancient Israel or the southern Levant. And it is related, the site, to very well-known figures of antiquity, be them the pharaohs, Thutmose III, who campaigned and fought a coalition of Syrian and South Levantine enemies at Megiddo in the 15th century BC, then Pharaoh Sheshonq I of the 22nd dynasty, and Necho of the 26th dynasty of Egypt, and of course Assyrian monarchs, first and foremost among them Tiglath-Pileser III, and biblical figures, the most important perhaps Solomon and Josiah, king of Judah. I will relate to both of them. And finally, we cannot ignore the fact that Megiddo is the location, apparently, of this Armageddon of the book of Revelations. Armageddon is probably a corruption of Har Megiddo, the Mount of Megiddo, and at the end of the lecture I will say a few words about, I will try to explain the reason or to suggest a reason for the prominence of Megiddo also in this myth of later times. So Let me start by saying that, for all these reasons, Megiddo became an iconic site. You can see in this picture the momentous meeting of the Pope Paul VI with the President of the State of Israel. It was more than a meeting. It was the first ever visit of a Pope to the Holy Land in 1964. And it was a very emotional meeting between the head of the Catholic Church and the President of the State of Israel, of the Jewish state. And they contemplated with the question of where to have this meeting in 1964 in December, and Jerusalem was out of the question because of politics. Finally, they targeted Megiddo as the place, Megiddo Armageddon, as the place of the meeting. And here you see, this very well-known event about 60 years ago. And for all these reasons, including, recent history, Megiddo was listed as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO a few years ago. So it's a World Heritage Site, and rightly so. Now, the place was excavated by 4 expeditions during the years. The first one was a German expedition. You can see here on the left-hand side top, operated at Megiddo in the beginning of the 20th century, between 1903 and 1905, which means 120 years ago. The excavator was Gottlieb Schumacher, who was an architect and an engineer, and a very good archaeologist, in fact, when we consider that he was there in the early years of archaeology. Then the University of Chicago, on the left-hand side bottom, they excavated at Megiddo with the funding from Rockefeller in between 1925 and 1938-9. They left because of the situation right before the beginning of the war in Europe. And this was probably the biggest expedition ever to have worked in Palestine and then the State of Israel. They were there for 14 years, working around the clock, almost 24/7, and in 14 years. And they managed to expose the site in a way that is unbelievable when we look at it today. When I look at Megiddo today and I say to myself, they worked there for 14 years, I suppose that considering the modern methods of archaeology, it would have taken me about 1,000 years to reach the same exposure. And it's not, don't make no mistake, it's not a criticism at all, because, they worked in the best method of the time, and they gave us these monuments that we can re-explore today in modern ways. Then Yigael Yadin of the Hebrew University, a very prominent archaeologist, Israeli archaeologist. He was one of the founders, in a way, of Israeli archaeology in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And here you can see him at Megiddo with another prominent figure in Israeli archaeology, Benjamin Mazar, picture taken in the late 60s. And finally, our own excavations. I started there in the beginning of the 90s, so 28 years ago, and I work at Megiddo every second year, because during the years at Megiddo I do also other work, field work, and not only field work, as you heard from Tim, also archaeological sciences projects and so on. So I I do not let myself indulge in excavating at Megiddo every year. So every second year is enough, I think. What you see here is also, as I mentioned to some of you before when we prepared the presentation for this evening, what you see here is also a challenge, I think, for an institution like the Getty. You can see the big sectional trench at Megiddo, excavated by the University of Chicago, all the way down to bedrock. There is no place like this anywhere in the Middle East that I know of, with such a trench that exposes, in fact, the entire history of the site, starting in Neolithic times, pre-pottery Neolithic times, and continuing until the Persian period in the 5th or 4th centuries BC. So this is the scope of activity at the site. And especially, of course, the bronze, from the early bronze, the Bronze Age and the Iron Ages are the prominent ones, the prominent periods. And there are, I mean, it depends how one counts, but I suppose that we can count at least 30 settlements, one on top of the other, representing the history, the entire history of the region of the southern Levant, and even beyond in a way, in this time span between the Neolithic and the Persian period. And Megiddo gave us features, more monuments from biblical times, more than any other site in the land of Israel. When we speak about Bible, so we speak about the land of Israel and neighboring regions, including Transjordan, including perhaps western Syria. More monuments than any other site. We have a look here. We see here the Megiddo gates, which were exposed by the University of Chicago in the 1920s and 1930s. Now, for me, the beauty of the site is the following. In my opinion, it is the only place in the entire ancient world. Here I take a step out of the southern Levant and out of the Levant, in fact, and I'm speaking for a minute about the ancient world. It is the only place in the ancient world where we have the full sequence of the Bronze and Iron Ages exposed, which means that I'm not speaking about a mound in Syria, for instance, or in southern Turkey, in other places where we can go and assume, according to survey material, that the whole sequence exists. But here it is exposed. It has been exposed in the many years of excavations since the beginning of the 20th century. And not only that, here, this is a picture which gives you some sort of a notion about the layers at Megiddo. Here we are in the late Bronze, basically, and the beginning of the Iron Age. But for instance, in 1922, we excavated Middle Bronze remains with a large number of layers, and as I will show you immediately, all of them radiocarbon dated. So yes, radiocarbon is very important. From the very beginning of my excavations at Megiddo, I had a plan, a program. Why am I here? What do I want to achieve at Megiddo? Because so many people worked there before me. So the idea was to come back to Megiddo and to first of all recheck the entire stratigraphy of the site and recheck the entire ceramic typology of the site, and then recheck the chronology. In the beginning, when I started in the 90s, radiocarbon was not that popular for the Iron Age, but since I would say in the last 22 years or so, 23 years, we turned to radiocarbon in order to date the layers instead of assumptions which stem from one's understanding of a given biblical verse here and there. And here we are on safer ground now, because when we come to biblical verses, we never know what exactly is the ideology or theology of the authors, when exactly the verse was written, whether it is real time or in later centuries, and there is always a question mark. Whereas radiocarbon is innocent of all this, so to speak. And Megiddo is the most, so to speak, the best radiocarbon dated site today, in my opinion, in the ancient world, may I say so. So not only full coverage, full exposure, better said, of the Bronze and Iron Age, but also Bronze and Iron Ages, but also full radiocarbon sequence with hundreds of samples taken so far. And in fact, this year, in 2022, we managed finally to achieve the goal that we set for ourselves many years ago, to fully radiocarbon date the entire sequence. So we really closed the gap that we still had for the Middle Bronze and the Intermediate Bronze Age. So now we have from the early Bronze 1, which means from the late 4th millennium BC, a little bit before 3000 BC, all the way down from there to the 8th century, or beginning of the 8th century, because after the beginning of the 8th century, for many reasons, I'm not going to go into this now, radiocarbon is not possible. But we do have the entire sequence of radiocarbon dating, and here you can see my colleague Steve Weiner from the Weizmann Institute. I had the project with him, with the Weizmann Institute, which was funded by the European Research Council, which had a component of chronology about 15 years ago. And this picture was taken a few years ago. So radiocarbon is very important. Now, let me turn to the topic, to the main thing that I want to share with you today, and this is how Megiddo really sheds light on several issues which are related to biblical history, and maybe it's really better to say biblical historiography, because there is some sort of difference between speaking about history or speaking about historiography. And when we speak about the Bible, we, in my opinion, speak mainly about historiography. I'm going from here to Denver next week to attend a session on biblical historiography in the conference of the Society for Biblical Literature. And I think there we will be speaking quite a lot about this very delicate difference between the two. So biblical historiography, which means to try to understand the background of the text and what the text can tell us and what not. So let me give you, I'm giving you this evening an overview of the subject, and let me start with a few words about the decline of late Bronze Canaan and late Bronze Megiddo between 1200 and 1100 BC, which means in the 12th century BC. Megiddo was a prospering late Bronze center in the late Bronze Age. It is mentioned in the Amarna tablets as one of the city-states of Canaan. A petty king was there. Biridia was his name. And we have letters of Biridia from Megiddo. And the remains that you see here, most of them come, in fact, the beautiful picture, black and white, from the excavations of the University of Chicago. The palace at Megiddo, which was in a fantastic state of preservation, is no more today because they removed it in order to continue excavating. And here too, I'm saying this with no criticism because this was the way of archaeology at the time. Today we do not just remove monuments like this. In any event, you can see some of the finds also, and one of the Amarna tablets for Megiddo. So Megiddo was a major city-state in Canaan in the Bronze Age. In the early Bronze Age, I suppose we can speak about a city-state already there, and certainly in the second millennium BC, which means in the Middle and Late Bronze Ages. And we dived into the question of the demise of Megiddo, and also to shed light on the end of the Bronze Age beyond Megiddo. And what we see today very clearly to differ from what we knew, what we had known 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, when I think Tim and I and John and Sarah started studying archaeology. We spoke about, sort of a moment of collapse of the Bronze Age culture. And it is a collapse, but it's not a moment. And at Megiddo, we see it very clearly that there are several steps of decline, starting around 1200 BC and continuing until around 1100 BC. And here I'm speaking radiocarbon dates. So combination of a very strong control over stratigraphy and very strong analysis of the ceramic typology, which means relative chronology, and then radiocarbon dating. We know today that there are several phases of decline at Megiddo, and that the final blow came only maybe slightly after the Egyptians pulled out from Canaan, because Canaan until, let's say, 1130 or so, until the time of the 20th, into the 20th dynasty of Egypt, was an Egyptian province of Canaan under direct Egyptian rule. And at a certain moment, the Egyptians pulled out from Canaan, from Megiddo. And here we have evidence, this nice piece that was found by the University of Chicago on the right-hand side is from the days of Ramesses VI, which means around 1130 BC. And it seems to me that Megiddo survived slightly later, maybe 30, 40 years later. Now, the main question, and here we get closer to biblical historiography and biblical history, if you wish, is what happened next? And this was a major question that was posed by archaeologists, historians, and biblical researchers during the years. What happened next? Was Megiddo taken by, can Megiddo be seen as quote-unquote Israelite in the 11th century BC? Was it controlled by the sea people, perhaps by one of the powers of Philistia? Or possibly there was some sort of revival of Canaanite culture. And here we come for the period between 1150 and 950 BC, which means we are speaking now about a century. Or if you wish, between 1100, there was a very slow recovery of the city, and then until 950 BC, so a century or a century and a half, I think that we can safely speak about revival of Canaanite culture. What do you mean Canaanite culture? I mean second millennium BC material culture continues into the beginning, very beginning of the 10th century BC. And we see this, in fact, in every aspect of material culture. Here I bring two of them. First of all, architecture. There is continuity of architecture typical of the Bronze Age with these courtyard houses. We know them in the second millennium, almost throughout the second millennium, and they continue beyond the year 1000 into the 10th century. And also the pottery repertoire that you see an example on the right-hand side. If you, I mean, take even a prominent scholar knowing well the pottery tradition of the Southern Levant, it's not always easy to make a distinction here between the very late Bronze Age, let's say the late 12th century BC, and what comes next. Here we have an assemblage from the destruction of Megiddo in the middle of the, perhaps even before the middle, the beginning, the first half of the 10th century BC, which means about a century after the collapse of late Bronze Canaan, and the repertoire looks quite similar to what we know from the period before. And this holds true, this is true also for the cult aspect of the site. First of all, this wonderful building, which had been exposed also by the University of Chicago in the 30s. This is the Migdal Temple, a very well-known monument at Megiddo. There are several other monuments like this, including one that Tim was excavating in Transjordan more than several years ago, I suppose we can say today. In any event, so this structure at Megiddo, which comes from the Middle Bronze Age, it was erected apparently in the Middle Bronze and survived for many centuries and went through several changes and reconstructions until definitely the late Bronze Age and then even beyond. And we know today that it continued into the beginning of the 10th century BC, and also the objects, one of them I'm bringing here, this figurine from Megiddo was found here in the destruction of the city in the beginning of the 10th century, and it is typical of the second millennium material culture. Not only material culture, we can say the same, and there are other aspects which I did not show here, of flint industry, of jewelry, of metallurgy. We have a major project in metallurgy at Megiddo. They all point to in the same direction. But not only material culture, also the distribution, the disposition of city-states is the same, which means that after the collapse of Canaan, of late Bronze Canaan, in the late 12th century or 1100 BC, we have some sort of revival of city-states, and the city-states are the same as before. You can see them here, Megiddo and Gat and Rehob, and another one in the valley, in the coast near Akko, on the northern coast of Israel. They are the same. They are the same centers that had been there before in the Bronze Age. Now, the big question is the end of this phase. This phase came to an end in a brutal devastation. In fact, this is the #1 destruction in the history of Megiddo. We can count several destruction layers in the late Bronze and Iron Ages. There is one, as I mentioned before, around 1100 BC. Then there is another one, this one, in the beginning of the 10th century. Then there is another destruction in the late 9th century, possibly related to conquest of Damascus in the territory of the northern kingdom of Israel. We'll get to it later. And then there is the final destruction by the Assyrians in 732 by Tiglath-Pileser during the campaign of Tiglath-Pileser III, when he took over these territories from the hands of the northern kingdom. But this one is really the #1 destruction, a complete devastation of the city, complete devastation that we identify in every place that we excavate, very dramatic. You can see on the left-hand side top, accumulation of more than a meter of destruction material, vessels, burnt bricks, and so on. And the question is exactly when this happened and what was the force or the group of people who brought Canaanite Megiddo or second millennium Megiddo to an end. So there are several possibilities here, and again, here we get closer to biblical historiography, I would say. First of all, regarding the date, we are here again fully radiocarbon dated, and we can see when we look at the entire valley, there are several destructions, not only at Megiddo, but other sites as well. And recently we have collected samples for radiocarbon, we and others, not only me, samples for radiocarbon dating from Megiddo and other places. I was involved also during this European Research Council project with radiocarbon dating other sites in the valley. And we can see that the radiocarbon tells us a story tells us that it is not the work of a single campaign, of a single event. There is difference of 2.5 or 3 standard deviations between the eastern and western part of the valley, and apparently we are speaking about a process of destructions rather than a single event. And at Megiddo, we are speaking about the beginning of the 10th century. I don't know exactly to tell you when, but it's before 950 for sure, and perhaps even before, even closer, not 1000, but maybe around 980, 970 BC, somewhere there. Radiocarbon cannot tell us more than give us, this uncertainty of 30 years perhaps in the beginning of the 10th century. Radiocarbon, if done well, and with the Bayesian model, where the stratigraphy is imposed on the results. And then when we think about it, and it's not a single campaign, so we cannot blame, let's say, Pharaoh Sheshonq I for this, because we are dealing with a process rather than with a single event. And I think that also looking at what happens next at Megiddo, we can safely say that this is probably the result of the expansion of I would call them the Highlanders. Let me just tell you why I call them the Highlanders and not Israelites. Because, this is a very tricky question of identity. And in the beginning of the Iron Age, the material culture of the groups is not very different. And thereby, I prefer to speak about Highlanders and Lowlanders than to stick to them, give them an identity. It's easier to give an identity with when the northern kingdom of Israel rises. And when we have documentation, also extra biblical documentation on the northern kingdom, on Israel, which means starting in the late 10th century. So the phase after, we can already speak about Israelites. But here, if you wish, these are Israelites because they come from the heartland of ancient Israel, from the highlands in the Iron One, and they expand into the valley. And in fact, by expanding into the valley, this expansion process is the beginning of the northern kingdom, establishing of the northern kingdom of Israel. And indeed, it is really interesting to look at the next phase, what happens next at Megiddo. So next, after this devastation, we have a big change after the destruction, a big change in material culture, in every aspect of material culture, in architecture, in the pottery repertoire. There's something new, unrelated to the, after probably a short gap of occupation of 20, 30 years, there's something new here in the second half of the 10th century, and this something can be already titled Israelite. Why? For the simple reason that this continues into the 9th century and into the 8th century without a break into the period already here of the northern kingdom of ancient Israel. So a complete change in material culture, in all aspects of material culture. And I'm bringing also here the famous block with the cartouches of Sheshonq the first, the founder of the 22nd dynasty, who campaigned in Canaan in the, what to say, somewhere between the middle, depends on Egyptian chronology, there are different views, somewhere there between the 60s and the 20s, or the 50s and the 20s of the 10th century BC. And today we can say for sure, I think there had been a debate regarding, how to identify the city which was taken over by Sheshonq I. And now we can say for sure, I think, that the block was part of a monument that was established at Megiddo already after the devastation of the second millennium city, which means with the phase that can be seen as the belonging to the northern kingdom of Israel, the early years of the northern kingdom. I think that I need to say a word here about something which was fiercely debated in the last, has been fiercely debated in the last 20 years, and this is the question of Solomonic Megiddo. So I will say only a few words about it very quickly. You know that Megiddo is mentioned in the Bible in relation to King Solomon, the famous Solomon. So here's the verse. I am bringing it to you on the left-hand side bottom. And this is the account of the forced labor. This is from the book of Kings, which King Solomon levied to build the house of the Lord and his own house and the Millo and the wall of Jerusalem and Hatzor and Megiddo and Gezer. And according to, this was a verse which strongly influenced Yigael Yadin, the famous Israeli archaeologist of the 50s and 60s, and he was the excavator of Hatzor. And he came up with a theory. He excavated at Hatzor and noticed that there are similar gates at Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer, and suggested that this is the layer that can be identified with the time of King Solomon. And he had in mind this reconstruction, which was very convincing at the time. When I came to study archaeology, this was the thing at the time, in the 70s, let's say, that, blueprints for construction of gates were dispatched from Jerusalem to the countryside, and they were building, their administrative cities of the United Monarchy, the great United Monarchy described in the Bible. This premise came under attack from different perspectives, from different directions. I mean, in the last 20 or maybe a little bit more, 25, 30 years, both from the side of biblical exegesis and from the direction of archaeology. And let me say this, I can relate to this in two ways. First of all, to say that the monuments which had been understood as belonging to the time of Solomon and brought, studied as symbols of the greatness of this united monarchy which was ruled from Jerusalem over the entire territory of ancient Israel. So these monuments, in fact, belong to the 9th century, not to the 10th century. And this was something that I suggested in the 90s because of certain issues related to material culture. But then when we started with radiocarbon, I think that now we can prove it without any hesitation, that the monuments, I'll speak about them in a second, they belong to the 9th century and not the 10th. And also from the point of view of biblical scholarship, biblical researchers started asking questions regarding the date of composition of the texts and the reality behind the text. And I certainly belong to the group of scholars, of researchers who think that these verses, that first of all, there is no writing of history in the 10th century BC in ancient Israel. Biblical material started to be composed, in my opinion, in the 8th century at the earliest, and mostly later than that. And there is very strong influence of the goals of the authors. So this is historiography, if you wish, to differ from history. And we cannot speak anymore of a great united monarchy of the time of David and Solomon, though we do not, I do not, for one, dismiss the historicity of David and Solomon as founders of the Davidic dynasty in Jerusalem, but the description of a great golden age of a united monarchy is more, in my opinion, an ideological construct than a real history. Having said that, let's take a look, first of all, observations on Israel, the northern kingdom, in the days of the Omride dynasty, because the Omrides, this is the first big dynasty of the northern kingdom, which is attested also not only in the Bible, and in the Bible by, I think, early writing in the north, in the Bible, texts that came into the Bible to Jerusalem from the north, but also by extra-biblical texts, and they are extremely important. They were a major power. I mean, we can call them some sort of a mini empire, not an empire in the sense of, you know, Egypt or Mesopotamian empires or the Hittites, but in the sense of the Levant, the two main powers in the Levant, which competed in the Iron Age for the hegemony over the region, were the northern kingdom of Israel and Damascus. And in fact, the 9th and 8th centuries is a story of either cooperation or confrontation between Israel and Damascus, Israel, the northern kingdom. So just for you, those of you who are not too much into biblical history, let me just remind you that we are speaking, according to the biblical description, two Hebrew kingdoms which emerge from the ruins of the united monarchy. If you are asking me and some other scholars, we are speaking about two Hebrew kingdoms which emerged side by side in parallel with the northern kingdom, the most prominent one. So we are speaking about the northern kingdom as the prominent, as the big story of the Iron Age, the prominent one from the point of view of demography, territory, economy, prosperity, trade, you name it. But the upper hand finally is with the Judahites because they wrote the story. So as you know, whoever has the pen is the winner. So Judah wrote the story of ancient Israel. I mean, Judahite authors wrote the story of ancient Israel, starting, I suppose, in the 7th century BC, using material that was written before in the northern kingdom, and telling the story from the point of view of Jerusalem and the Jerusalem monarchs and the Jerusalem priesthood of the 7th century BC. But as long as Israel was there prospering, in fact, Israel controlled, in a way, Judah. And I think that it should be fair to say that in the 200 years that Judah and Israel lived side by side, I think half of that time Israel really ruled over Judah. Judah was a vassal of the northern kingdom, in my opinion, both during the time of the Omride dynasty and also in the first half of the 8th century. So for the Omrides, here's a picture of one of those palaces that had before been associated with King Solomon, and today, thanks to radiocarbon dating, we know that they belong to the date in the first half of the 9th century and belong to the time of the Omride monarchs. And the Omrides, as you all know, I suppose, are mentioned by several extra biblical sources. We see here three monuments. On the left-hand side, the Mesha stele for Moab in Transjordan, referring to the dynasty, especially to King Omri. who was the father of King Ahab, the most well-known of them. And then the Assyrian monument by Shalmaneser III, describing the Battle of Karkar in 853 BC, and he relates to Ahab the Israelite. This is the first time that we have the name Israel, except for the 13th century reference in the Merneptah stele. So after a long time, 350 years, the name Israel appears again in an extra biblical text. Ahab the Israelite is the strongest monarch, the strongest army, military power in the coalition in the Battle of Karkar against Assyria in 853. And then on the right-hand side, we have an inscription from Tel Dan in Israel, which was established there in the north by Hazael, king of Damascus, after the decline of the Omride dynasty, but referring to them and to their conquest in Syria before his time. Now, this is again the palace which had been associated with King Solomon, and as I told you, we now know from radiocarbon seriation and from many radiocarbon dates, and from, radiocarbon dating is not enough to do, a certain layer. You have to do a sequence and to put it into a statistical package in a proper way in order to diminish the uncertainties in the results. So we know very well today that we are speaking here about the beginning of the 9th century in this beautiful palace. There are two of them. This is one, and there is another one which had been excavated by the University of Chicago and removed. So we cannot recheck it today. Because I'm giving this lecture at the Getty, I think that I should also say a few words about to be an archaeologist and work at a site like this, which is very prominent in tourism. It's a national park, accepting a very large number of visitors every year. And we always have to be, hands on deck regarding restoration, yes or no, what to let and what not to let the Parks Authority do. And sometimes we work in cooperation, sometimes we have different opinions about what needs or can be done and what not. But basically the site, the work that they do at the site is good work, and supervised by good architects and good engineers, and studying, the archaeology of the site properly. So here is a very delicate reconstruction of this palace of the 9th century. There was a big debate how far we can go up, and we, the archaeologists, really were against, too much of a Disneyland over there. And we kept, the restoration very modest, and then, of course, explanations in science. And here we see another monument which had been associated before with King Solomon. This is the famous Megiddo Gate on the left-hand side top, from the excavations of the University of Chicago in the 30s. And first of all, it has recently been reconstructed. I mean, the missing part. The University of Chicago removed half of the monument, and tourists came there and did not understand what was going on. It was very difficult to explain because, you are standing with tourists and telling them that this is a gate, and there is no gate. So the Parks Authority did a good job, I think, in recent years, investing in this and reconstructing the missing part exactly to the centimeters according to the plans of the University of Chicago, and using also similar material. And we carried out excavations there, as you can see on the right-hand side top, before the work, in order to get a better sense of the stratigraphy and the history of the gates. And there too, we could, I think, show very clearly that the gate is not from the 10th century, but was established in the 9th century and continued to be used later. And there are also several gates later on top of it. There are other things that we can study at Megiddo regarding the Northern Kingdom. One of them is about cult practices. And this is very meaningful. There are, as you can see here, several areas that we excavate in the the southeastern sector of the mound. And we can speak about the following. as you remember, I showed you a picture of the power of the tower temple of Megiddo, which survived until the beginning of the 10th century. And then after the destruction of this city, and there is this revival under probably the northern kings of ancient Israel in the 50 years before the Omrides. There are already kings also mentioned in the Bible, and there is a reason to accept their historicity in any event in the first 50 years. And here again we have a major monument as a temple, which means the idea of a city with a major temple continues into the very early years of the Northern Kingdom, which means into the second half of the 10th century BC. And this building is radiocarbon dated around 900 BC, give or take 10, 15 years. So this is the sort of uncertainty that we can speak about. But there is an interesting phenomenon, an interesting process going on after this period, which means during the time of the Omride dynasty, there is a big change at Megiddo. No more central temple, but now we have a cult room in the administrative building of the site, which means that the dynasty puts its hand on the cult. Cult is power. A religious center is power from the point of view of economy and so on. And they concentrate, there's no more major temple at Megiddo, but the cult activity takes place in the 9th century and also in the beginning of the 8th century in the administrative building, so under the eyes and under the hands of the central authority of the kingdom at Samaria, the capital of the Northern Kingdom. Then there are interesting things to say, and I will try to speed up a little bit in order to be on time. So there are very interesting things to say about writing in the Northern Kingdom, especially not too much evidence, but still interesting. Here we have 2 letters only from an inscription in Proto-Canaanite. And this inscription comes from the beginning of the 9th century, so it indicates that Proto-Canaanite, the very early alphabetic writing, continues later than thought before, which means in the 9th century at Megiddo, and I think also in other places. On the other hand, there are not very many inscriptions from the territory of the Northern Kingdom in the 9th century, and this is still a major question mark in the history of the Northern Kingdom. How is it that during the time of a very strong dynasty, a mini empire such as the one ruled by the Omrides, we don't have enough evidence for writing? And I will keep this with a question mark. I don't have enough time to go into this. Finally, 2 more chapters in the history of Megiddo in 5 or 6 minutes before I close. A few observations on the 8th century. 8th century, there is a tremendous prosperity at the site. I think that the first half of the 8th century is the point of the peak period of prosperity in the Northern Kingdom, probably mainly under the rule of a very strong monarch who is not very well known today, and also diminished in the Bible because of ideology that comes from Jerusalem and the Jerusalem priesthood and so on in later years. His name was Jeroboam, so we call him Jeroboam II, and he was the greatest, I think, monarch of the Northern Kingdom. We have evidence for this from here and from my own excavations at Kiryat Yearim, not so far from Jerusalem. We have here a volunteer from the dig at Kiryat Yearim, which I carried out a few years ago. In any event, here you have a picture of the stables of Megiddo, the horse industry of Megiddo. By the way, it's a major industry which has to do with supply of horses to the military powers of the time, including Assyria. And I think that many of the verses mentioning the stables and stalls and chariots of King Solomon, in fact, come from the reality of the beginning of the 8th century, which means about 2 centuries after the time of Solomon, which means history that they still remembered in Judah in the 8th century and telescoped it into the time of King Solomon. And this is the reality here that we see, the city of the stables. One of them was excavated by us, and we know today, first of all, I have to say that there was a big question whether these are stables at all. Some authorities suggested that we are dealing with storehouses, and there were other solutions. And we know today, for different aspects, this time, unfortunately, not from the sciences. We failed in our attempts to show this from the point of view of the sciences, from the sediments in the stables, but we have other lines of evidence to argue that we are dealing here with indeed stables of the first half of the 8th century. And again, homage to the Getty. Here is a restoration of, I think, a nice restoration and a very accurate one by a very talented architect of one of the stables. So this city has also a beautiful water system. We did not add any information on this because this was excavated by the University of Chicago, and I'm showing it to you only to demonstrate the power of the Northern Kingdom. Another theme which is interesting, and again, I don't have enough time maybe to elaborate on it, is all sorts of ideas that have to do with foodways and biblical taboos. You know that, and here you have, we conducted a very massive program. We are still conducting a very massive program of archaeology, of looking at the bones, at the animal bones at Megiddo. And we see interesting features in the animal bones, including the fact that there are high percentages of pigs in the layers of representing the Northern Kingdom of Israel, unlike Judah. Judah of the time, and you can see the differences in the map here, Judah of the time does not, in the late 8th century, maybe 30, 40 years after Israel, but Judah of the late 8th century does not have pigs in the layers at Lachish and other places. And we raised the possibility that perhaps the taboo on pigs does not come from an ancient memory of we and they vis-a-vis, ancient Israel and Philistia, because this is very complicated, but more so from the differences between Israel and Judah in the 8th century BC. Finally, let me say, do I have two or 3 minutes to wrap it up? Thank you. So finally, let me say just a few words about the final act here. I promised you in the beginning to say several words about the whole thing of Armageddon of the book of Revelations, and perhaps also a hint in the book of Zechariah in the biblical record. So this is the city after the Assyrian conquest. Megiddo became a capital of an Assyrian province, and it was called Megiddo, the province. And there are 2 palaces that had been excavated by the University of Chicago, and we re-excavated them in order to extract more information, and we continue to do so. There is one place where we continue even today to shed light on the period after 732 BC. And this brings me to the question indeed of Armageddon. You know, Armageddon of the book of Revelation. You have the citation on top. And then there is a clue also for the same tradition, I think, in the book of Zechariah, and I'm bringing it to you below in a part of the book of Zechariah that biblical scholars usually date to the 5th century BC. So the question is, where does this idea, this tradition of Megiddo as the eschatological tradition that at Megiddo, at the end of times, there will be a major battle between the forces of God and the forces of evil, and the forces of God will prevail. Where does it come from, this idea that you can find in the book of Revelation, written by John of Patmos in the 1st century? So where does it come from? This is many centuries after Megiddo was deserted altogether. There's no Hellenistic Megiddo and no early Roman Megiddo. The Persian period is the last phase. So there is one explanation according to which the whole thing comes from the memory of the place as a location of terrible battles in the past that decided the fate of the ancient world, such as Thutmose III in the 14th century, 15th century, sorry. I find it difficult to assume that memory of the 15th century was preserved, in the valley, until the 1st century. So, in my opinion, this is not a viable explanation. It is a possibility, but not a viable explanation. A much better one is that there was this memory of the killing of King Josiah of Judah at Megiddo by Pharaoh Necho of Egypt in 609 BC. Now, there are two stories on this in the Bible, one in the book of Kings and one in Chronicles, telling different stories. Chronicles elaborates and speaks about a battle. But we know that Judah was not capable to fight, a big Egyptian army of the 26th dynasty. The book of Kings simply speaks about Josiah being called to come to Megiddo to approach the Pharaoh, and he executed Josiah there. And Josiah is described in the Bible as the most righteous king of the lineage of David. He is the ultimate king. If you read very carefully your Bible, you'll see that he is described in words that David is not described, that not even other kings, righteous kings like Hezekiah of the late 8th century. They compare him to Moses. He's the only king who is being compared to Moses in the Hebrew Bible. And he was executed at Megiddo in 609. And I think that this execution of Josiah was in the memory of the people of the region. This is why we already have it in the book of Zechariah about a century later, or maybe less than a century later, and then into Jewish apocrypha of the Hellenistic period, and from there to, this eschatology idea and messianic idea that at the end of times there will be this battle and another righteous David will emerge after the winning of the forces of God, the victory of the forces of God, from this battle at the same place where the last righteous David died in 609 BC. Now, all this is a nice story, and the question is whether I, as an archaeologist, can put my hand on it. The answer is probably, I have to be careful here. The answer is probably perhaps with 3 question marks, but 4 question marks, to be on the safe side. Here is something for John and Sarah here. We now have a phase at Megiddo in the late 7th century BC. We can date it, not radiocarbon, by in other means. A combination of pottery, paleomagnetism, and so on. Second half of the 7th century, which means the time of the 26th dynasty in Egypt, the time of King Necho and his campaign to the north. And in this layer, we have East Greek pottery and Egyptian pottery in the same layer. East Greek and Egyptian, and as some of you may know, East Greek pottery sometimes is associated with Greek mercenaries, and possibly Greek mercenaries in the service of the 26th dynasty of Egypt. So here we can wrap it up in a way that this is a possible clue for, not the events at Megiddo, but the background of the events at Megiddo in the late 7th century. The East Greek pottery was checked by NAA, neutron activation analysis, and found to be probably from southeastern Asia Minor, from the area of Miletus. So another clue, Lydia. And there are clues, several clues in the Bible for the fact that Lydian mercenaries were probably associated, this is interpretation, probably associated with the killing of Josiah at Megiddo in 609 BC. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderful overview of not just the site of Megiddo, but it is a central reference point for so many of the big issues in late Bronze and Iron Age archaeology in Israel. So it does bring all of those things into play. We do have time for some questions. Any hands up? No. How about online? Do we have some questions from Zoom, shall we?
We do. We have some questions. One is the process of reestablishing cities like Megiddo after a destruction, and whether you have a sense of what kind of people return first and who follow.
I think that the people who probably the question relates to the devastation of Megiddo in around 1100 BC and the revival thereafter of this late Canaanite or late second millennium city. I think that the people are the people of the region, the same people. Also, I think that it is fair to say that the destruction of late Bronze Megiddo around 1100 BC was a partial destruction. There is no complete devastation. So there is destruction of the palace area and some other areas, and there could have been a very short decline or a gap, but basically the people of the Jezreel Valley, the people of the region came back to the site and re-established a city there, in the beginning a very modest one, and then prospering in a major center of a city-state. So we are speaking about the same people. By the way, even when we turn out, and here I take a risk, of course, by saying this, but okay, I'm ready to take the risk. You know, even when we speak about the first millennium and about the Northern Kingdom, we are not dealing with the replacement of populations. You know, it's not a situation that all Canaanites, or as I call them, lowlanders, disappear and only highlanders take over. I mean, this is a mixture of population. The political takeover is by the highlanders, but the population of the valley remains the same population of old, of the second millennium into the first millennium and later. And I'll tell you something, because nobody listens to this now, not even on Zoom, so I can break the news to you, that, you know, we published recently a major article on the population of the second millennium BC at Megiddo, ancient DNA. So I'm sorry. So we have evidence, ancient DNA, for the structure of the population in the second millennium. We published it in a major article, in a major journal in Cell. And I now have evidence from Kiryat Yarim, from a burial which is 7th century BC, and the first time ever that people who can be associated with the kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem of the 7th century BC, late monarchic times in Judah, they have the same genetic profile as the people of the second millennium BC. So for me, it did not come as a surprise, but it is, you know, reaffirming what we have known from material culture for a long time, that we are dealing with the same stock of population of the Levant.
I read an article recently that signs of people who were actually following, you know, Jewish law were relatively recent, you know, and I'm just wondering, when did you see some sign that there are people who are following the Torah? When do you see that?
Oh, yes. This is a major question. I think you read an article in Haaretz by Ariel David,
Yes.
a review on a book which has recently been published on the emergence of Judaism, something like this. Yes, here we have to make a distinction, and I support the same kind of, the same idea. I make a distinction between, Judaitism, can I say this? Judaite culture and Judaism. These are the same things in a process, but not exactly the same things. So Judaism, as we understand today, Jewish law, comes, in my opinion, rightly following this book that has recently been published from the time of the Hasmoneans in the 2nd century BC, but it doesn't mean that there are no roots back in the Iron Age and in monarchic times. Of course there are, but we are speaking about a process, and it is important to say when we are now striding into a minefield, of course, but I am striding into a minefield But you know, it also depends on the question of the final composition of the Torah. And here there are different opinions. And you know, most scholars today would say that the final compositions, the priestly material especially, and post-priestly material in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, comes from the Persian or early Hellenistic times. In my opinion, perhaps even slightly later, perhaps. So I hope that but anyway, this is what we see here is the Israelite culture of the Iron Age at Megiddo, and then Judahite culture of the Iron Age. So I specifically Judahite, and we cannot call these people Jews yet, in my opinion at least.
So they're not eating a pig. That has no religious basis, or it was just part of the culture?
So the question is here this is a very good question. Here we see a phenomenon, okay, and then we have to interpret it. Why? What's going on? Why they turn to pigs in the Northern Kingdom? And we, in an article which we published when was it, 9 years ago, I think, in a journal in Germany, we, dealing with ancient Israel, we suggested that it has to do with the economy of the Northern Kingdom before the Assyrian takeover, with the strong demographic expansion in the countryside, diminishing areas for pasture, and so on. We gave some sort of an ecological explanation. It's an interpretation, you know, you can accept or not. The fact is there, but the question, of course, is how to understand it. You took me into very dangerous areas.
We have Shelby and then another one in the front.
Yes, Shelby.
Okay, we'll start with.
We have another question that relates to interpretation. The reconstructed the fortification walls from the Amorite period appear to be constructed with finely hewn stones instead of casemate walls, similar to the walls of Samaria. Was this typical for Amorite fortress walls throughout and in response to Assyrian battering rams?
Difficult to answer. I would say the following, and it doesn't come from Megiddo. Megiddo is not fortified in the 9th century. So in the 9th century, under the Amorites, this is a beautiful city with monuments, palaces, and an elaborate gate, and so on, but there is no fortification. So the gate is some sort of a ceremonial gate, entrance into a royal administrative center, but there are no first fortifications at Megiddo can be detected in the first half of the 8th century, for the Iron Age, I mean, leave alone just a minute, the 2nd millennium BC, the Middle Bronze. But in other places, yes, the answer is that the question is good. I mean, there is evidence for major earthworks and fortifications, including casemate walls in Amorite cities, including Samaria. Whether they are related to battering rams, yes or no, it's an interpretation, as you rightly said, and I simply don't know the answer. I don't know. There is no evidence for confrontation with Assyria before the 8th century BC. And I am not sure that the confrontation with Damascus in the second half of the 9th century was such that demanded preparations and fortifications like this. I'm not sure, but maybe.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation of the excavations in Megiddo. I wanted to ask, thinking about Professor Gilboa's recent publication on the role that Tel Dor played in the Phoenician expansion before Tel Dor became annexed by the northern Israel kingdom, whether you have any evidence of production activities that would show that Megiddo also played such a role while it was still within the Canaanite milieu?
Of course, Dor is a better place to look for Phoenician influence on the coast than Megiddo. But yes, we have also evidence for Megiddo, for Phoenician, quote-unquote or not, And also we published several articles on Cypriot and Greek importations, which is related to commercial activities in the Eastern Mediterranean. And here Megiddo is very strong, and I'll tell you why. Because of our accurate dating. I recently became a little bit blunt about it, and I have to be careful when I speak to my fellow archaeologists. Maybe they don't like it so much. I gave a lecture in Tel Aviv a month ago or so, and I told them, guys, line up. Line up simply. Why? Because this is a site which is fully radiocarbon dated. And this should be the skeleton for what we know about, questions like this. Some of the questions come from the sciences, such as we are now for instance, giving the skeleton or the compass, if you wish, for paleomagnetism research in the entire region, not only in Israel, also beyond Syria and so on. And we can really give the minute processes that took place in a given period, such as the one I showed you on the late Bronze Age, but also the Iron Age. So, for instance, the beginning of re-importation of Cypriot material, for instance, the famous black on red to the Levant, we can give it a date today, precisely, I suppose, at Megiddo, and this is a major contribution. And Megiddo plays also a role in understanding or shedding light on chronology of Greece, Iron Age Greece. I was involved, John, he's here, knows better than me all this. I was involved a little bit with attempts to bridge between the Aegean Basin and the Levant in the Iron Age. Also working, taking samples for radiocarbon dating from several sites in Greece, including Lefkandi and other sites. And and Megiddo is also part of this story in a way. But again, for the Phoenician question per se, I think Dor is a better site.
How far back is there evidence of like one is Megiddo area?
I couldn't understand, sorry.
How far back was Megiddo first settled or built up?
Okay, so the first settlement with evidence coming only from the small finds, not architecture, is from the pre-pottery Neolithic, late pre-pottery Neolithic, which means, I suppose, 7th millennium BC into the 6th millennium. This is the very beginning. We have evidence from flint material, and then in the pottery Neolithic, also pieces of pottery. And then we have also Chalcolithic at Megiddo. But the major first phase, which I did not show to you, and it's really important and fascinating, is in the very beginning of the early bronze, which means the late 4th millennium. We have at Megiddo the most monumental single building anywhere in the region. And when I say in the region, it's beyond the borders of Israel or the Palestinian Authority or Jordan. In the entire Levant, southern Levant for sure, for this phase of the late 4th millennium, radiocarbon dated somewhere in the, let's say, two to three last centuries of the 4th millennium BC, between, let's say, 3,300 and 3,000, yes, BC. Major temple, 50 on 30 meters big, made of stones, very monumental, and also signifying, also demonstrating or exhibiting something beyond, which means it is a very good demonstration for the first process of urbanization in Canaan or in the southern Levant in the late 4th millennium. But this is something which was beyond the scope of this lecture.
Just if you could address the population densities of Megiddo and the other city-states, they fluctuate.
Okay, great. Yes, this is. I'll try, and we really contemplated with this. I think that you know, there is a big discussion of what is the number that can be taken per given piece of land, the factor of population density. And the factor is given only according to one item, and this is, let's say, pre-modern populations of the region of the Middle East, doing ethnoarchaeology work or ethnographic work on populations of the Middle East in, let's say, 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, pre-modern populations, and here and there also even later. And there is some sort of an understanding that we are speaking about something like 200 people per hectare. So if we calculate Megiddo as 11 hectares, something like that in the Bronze Age, maybe a little bit less in the Iron Age. So 11 hectares takes you to what, 2,000 people? Maybe a little bit less because Megiddo was a center of a city-state, and there is the palace and the temple and monumental buildings. So it's not fully occupied. Part of it is administrative, official, priests, and so on. So maybe a little bit less, in my opinion at least, than 2,000. However, we should look also at the countryside. This is important. And of course, when we started excavating at Megiddo, we started asking questions about the countryside. And in the late 90s, we carried out a survey of the eastern part of the Jezreel Valley, the countryside of Megiddo. And we have a very good notion on the density of population there, number of sites and size of sites, which can be translated. Number of sites and size can be translated to population. So there is the Megiddo countryside. So there's the center ruling over a countryside. Now, we know for the late Bronze Age, for instance, where the neighboring city-states are, let's say from the Amarna tablets. So we can really delineate the territory of Megiddo, and then we see how many sites there are, villages. So the city-state controls the villages. And there in the countryside, we are speaking probably in a city-state like this about several thousand people, maybe up to 6, 7, 8, 10,000 people, including the countryside.
I think we probably need to leave it there, so it just remains for me to ask you to join me in thanking Professor Finkelstein for such a wonderful lecture.
Thank you.